The black abyss whistles with the sound of a blowing wind, an eerie wind unlike any other. He cannot move, he cannot feel, for he is no longer a thing, just a thought lost in the empty void. He begins to hear rumbling as if something were gathering power. This culminates in a blast of bright blue light, a torrent of lightning and flame. The wave of destruction envelops him, and he can feel a shock run through his every nerve. He snaps out of it, waking up with a jump. Just a dream. He was right where he was when he fell asleep. Oxus Rhetorius, an Astartes lost in a strange world, takes multiple deep breaths to calm himself down. After that, he looks around the room he's in. Something changed. The walls have sustained damage from the inside. It could be lashes of electricity. And yet, no sign of forced entry. Oxus begins to stand up, but stops when his foot contacts multiple unseen objects. They rolled along the floor as Oxus saw exactly what they were. They were loose bolts used for the standard bolt gun. He assumes they must have fallen out of his magazines somehow. He grabs one of his mags and notices it's full. No worries. He'll just grab another. And another. The vast majority of his magazines were full. The only ones that weren't were the ones he had unloaded during yesterday's bout of bug killing. Oxus remembers the dream he woke from. The shock he felt was very real. Between that, the extra bolts along the ground, and the damage on the walls, Oxus began to wonder. The warp, had it traveled through him? It was a mystery for sure, but Oxus decided he'd need to figure that out later, among other things. He takes a few minutes to fill his magazines, but stops before he leaves. There's something nagging at him. Almost instinctually, he grabs his chainsword. And there it was. Except, it wasn't his chainsword. This one was red, and had the familiar symbol of a blood drop upon it. This weapon was property of the Blood Angels. Oxus didn't care, and simply disarmed himself of the weapon. It was a chainsword all the same. Once he finally left the building, Oxus was immediately bombarded with a thought and a feeling. He's starving. His nutrient reservoir must have been broken, a problem he'd have to deal with once he figures out how to remove his armor. In the meantime, he'd have to eat manually. His stomach grumbles angrily as Oxus immediately searches the other buildings. Briefly looking around the building he just came from, nothing. He looks in another. Still no food, but there was another interesting find. A large weapon clutched in the hands of a skeleton in a tattered blue jumpsuit. The skeleton looked quite human, giving Oxus a feeling of hope deep in his heart. He picks up the weapon, noting that while big for a human, it's too small in the hands of an Astartes like himself. He takes it outside and gently pulls the trigger. It projects a great beam of pale yellow light. A laser cannon. However, Oxus soon learned that his trigger pull, delicate as it was, had damaged the trigger, causing the weapon to be stuck firing non-stop. He fiddles with the thing carefully, non-stop, for a few seconds, until he finally turns it off. A brief once-over tells Oxus that he's broken the laser cannon. He's left with a bitter feeling. This weapon may have been useless in his hands, but he couldn't help but feel bad for breaking such a mastercraft of weaponry. With a quick check in the third building, Oxus confirms that there is no food in his immediate area. He looks out into the wild lands before him. Would he have to brave this day without food? Then he saw it. Littered across the land, the remains of yesterday's great battle. Dead bugs all around. Oxus looked at the broken laser cannon, and an idea came to mind. Oxus spent the next hour preparing his breakfast. He had carved the meat off of the charger, gathered parts from warriors and hive guards that he could, and even found a couple of scavengers that were just intact enough for him to collect. With his technical proficiency, he had fashioned the laser cannon into a utensil of which to roast the bug meat over. It was tuned to use just enough power to generate a blistering hot laser, but not so much as to incinerate his food. He started with the chunk of charger meat. He'd never cooked anything like this before, but his culinary skills were enough for him to make an educated guess as to the perfect amount to cook it. After roasting, he pulled it off the piece of rebar and took a big chomp out of it. The meat broke down quickly, almost melting in his mouth, as he was satisfied by the smoky, almost sickly sweet taste of the charger. He immediately began cooking another bug, a whole scavenger. Even if this piece of charger meat was larger than his head, it would not satisfy his hunger. Perfected digestion and energy preservation could only take an 8-foot muscle tank so far. After finishing the charger, he ate the scavenger next. Its brittle exoskeleton had a toasty, light crisp to it that broke away like thin wafers. The inside didn't entirely melt away like the charger flesh, but it was nice and juicy, with plenty of natural oils and fats. He pulled off a leg and slurped at the inside. It was not enjoyable. There was more grease than meat. Next came the most significant part he needed to cook, the head of a hive guard. He held it by the armored part of its head and ate the meat behind it as if eating out of a bowl. The hive guard had the consistency of lobster or some kind of shellfish. Curious, as this was not an aquatic creature. He made it to the brain, which hadn't been cooked all the way. Oxus didn't mind. How harmful could it really be? The brain was mushy and slimy, but simultaneously had a sweet and savory factor. Half an hour had passed before he had eaten probably 400 pounds of roasted alien insects. Only then was Oxus ready to brave the wilds of this new world. He packs up his makeshift burner and marches north into the morning of this dangerous desert. His sense of wonder and curiosity is overshadowed by his deep-seated sense of horror for the unknown. For all he knows, the very earth itself could come alive to swallow him. Regardless, he keeps walking. Only a coward would let fear stagnate him. The morning sun had not yet scorched the air of the desert, giving Oxus the pleasure of the cool breeze to keep him going. He let his gaze wander across the landscape and let his guard down to admire the environment as he walked. He appreciated the giant black rock formations, a fascinating sight in a desert of tan dirt. He noted the yellow somethings creeping over the rocks. What could it be? Perhaps a mucus-like substance that had solidified to the point of crystallization, no doubt from the Xenos he had met. The enjoyment of his time was short-lived when there was nothing new to see, and the desert rapidly heated up. Half an hour had passed, and his temperature regulator had kicked in to keep him stable. But not far up ahead, he caught sight of a deep crater with multiple tendrils of smoke illuminated by an orange light snaking up from numerous different points within the crater. It could be worth a look. Upon drawing close, Oxus crouches and quietly looks into the crater. More of these hideous bugs. He spots the points from which the smoke rises. Tunnel entrances lined with orange pustules down the inside as far as Oxus could see. He took note of some bugs leaving the tunnels and exiting the crater from a steep path, while others entered from the same direction, carrying some indistinguishable wildlife to climb into the holes. All the while, a handful of bugs were sitting in the middle of the crater, comfortably but on alert. Two of them looked like the brood commander he had killed yesterday, but even more. More spikes, more size, more hatred, more everything. Oxus had found a bug nest. With a quick once-over, Oxus counted 8 tunnels. It was clear to him what needed to happen next. Kill them. All of them. He tries to sneak around the nest to find an optimal entry point, but slips on a patch of loose dirt, tumbling into the pit below. On his way down, his armored body smashes one of the tunnels, causing it to collapse and block up. When he stands, he sees every single bug has their attention turned to him. He spares not a moment to blast every bug he sees with his bolt gun, spraying munitions in every forward direction. Most bugs died in 1 or 2 hits, but the greater brood commanders, alphas, tanked a few more hits. When the immediate area was primarily clean of living alien scum, Oxus turned his fire to one of the alphas. It sustained considerably more hits than almost any other bug he'd encountered so far. Both alphas made it quite close to him before Oxus could kill one. The second one charged on over, hitting him in the left paw and throwing him off balance. He quickly recovers and begins firing at the red monstrosity. It lets out a call, prompting a cluster of even more bugs to spring from the ground in nearby tunnels. Warriors, hive guards, and new, more strange-looking warriors accompanied the alpha. That is, before Oxus blew it into chunks in a matter of seconds. He was surrounded. Oxus quickly laid on the trigger to kill as many bugs as quickly as he could, but he had used the last of his clip, and these new warriors were wicked fast. He used his gun as a melee weapon to bash a few bugs away and slice at others with his bayonet. He took one hand off his gun to arm the other with the chainsaw. With every bug he smashed or cleaved apart, another flanked him, pouncing and pressing down on him with its tremendous weight. Swarmed and surrounded, Oxus kept fighting, even when he had been down on his knees. Every bug had an angle to attack him. Even if his armor protected him from most hits, they were still enough to shove him further and further into the ground. Oxus knew he was over-encumbered. More and more he was obscured from the light as the Xeno scum overwhelmed him. But through the pain and the crushing forces, he knew he could not falter. A death like this would be unbecoming of an Astartes. He relaxed himself, letting the bugs become comfortable with his lack of resistance as he curled up. Then, when the time was right, he mustered up all of his strength and sprang upward, throwing every single bug away from him. He charged forward, cleaving apart 2 warriors as he ran to find an open space to stand. All the time that had passed had caused more bugs to emerge from the tunnels. Most were scavengers, which Oxus effortlessly stomped on as he repositioned himself. Finally, he found a moment to reload his bolt gun, but almost right on cue, a warrior hurls itself from a nearby tunnel. Hopped up on abnormally strong post-human adrenaline, Oxus simply runs over to it with a fully loaded gun, grabs it by the neck, and shoves it back into the hole. He then proceeds to shoot at the warrior stuck in the hole, unloading his entire magazine in the process. After his little tantrum, he acknowledges 2 things. 1, this was a massive waste of ammo. 2, his bolter had successfully destabilized the tunnel from the inside, causing it to collapse. Case in point, his bolter is capable of closing bug holes. Useful information. The ground trembles and Oxus feels the earth sunder beneath him. He looks back and sees a horrendous sight lumbering over the nest. What he saw was a colossal bug, possibly 40 feet tall, with visible sacks of green bile on its underside and thick plates of black armor all over its body. Oxus stops and stares at the majesty of the Bile Titan for only a moment before reloading his bolter faster than ever before. As the Titan made its way into the nest, Oxus fired at it, hitting a particularly fragile area on one of its giant pointy legs. This causes the Titan to lose its footing, sliding the rest of the way into the nest along the cliffside. One of its legs veers off to the side, crushing one of the tunnels as the Titan finally regains balance. Oxus keeps shooting until his mag is empty. He notes how the Bile Titan's armor allows it to sustain an incredible amount of damage from his bolt gun. From all around him, more bugs swarmed him from all sides. A handful of hunters soar through the air to attack him, only for Oxus to use his plasma pistol to turn them into ash. The Bile Titan rears its head back, a bright green light flashing for a second before unleashing a torrent of boiling acidic fluid. Oxus just ran, the Bile trailing behind him as the Titan tried to keep up. Along the way, some of the Titan's fellow bugs were caught in the crossfire, burning them from the outside if the force alone didn't crush their bodies. It kept going until it had no more bile to spare. Oxus checked himself. He had 2 remaining crack grenades and knew exactly how to use them. One he threw high, letting it arc down and stick itself to the top of the Titan's carapace. Another he tossed into a nearby bug tunnel. The blast was strong enough to collapse not only the tunnel it was tossed into, but also a nearby tunnel. Meanwhile, the other grenade blasted a chunk of armor off of the Titan's back. Oxus quickly counted the remaining tunnels. 3 left, and bugs were still pouring from every direction. A charger breaches the dirt from the ground beneath him, throwing Oxus into the air. Just as he hits the ground, he notices how different the charger looks. It has more armor, a detail he has only a second to acknowledge before the charger catches him with its massive, armored head and slams him against the nearest rock wall. Having dropped his bolt gun, Oxus holds the beast back as its jaws snap at him, trying to take a bite of his armored flesh. Then he has an idea. He quickly whips out his plasma pistol and begins to let it charge. After that, he shoves it deeply into the giant bug's throat. This causes the charger to relent, allowing Oxus to shove the beast off of him. He watches as the disgusting alien gags as it tries to cough out his weapon, when suddenly, a wet burst of flesh from beneath the charger, as the pistol explodes from overcharging. It dies instantly. Oxus moves around the charger, noticing the Bile Titan getting ready to bombard him once again. Before it gets the chance, Oxus revs up his chainsword and throws it at the Titan's face. It forces itself right into its mouth, causing the Titan to reel back in pain. It tries shaking its head, trying to shake loose the piece of sharp metal without hands of its own. Meanwhile, more bugs were preparing to attack Oxus. A hunter flew in his direction, which he caught in his hands and crushed. He threw its remains at another hunter as it tried to tackle him as well. He makes a mad dash towards his bolter, stopping only to deal with any warriors or hive guards in his way. Using his fists and his immense strength, he pounds every bug as hard as he can, every hit breaking the carapace and sending their yellow blood flying. Though his kill count is small, he intends to only pacify them until he has a more efficient means of killing them. That is, until he spots a brood commander charging at him. He catches it by the mandibles, kicking it in the head hard enough to send it soaring backward, having ripped off its mandibles. He looks around at the bugs surrounding him. As they run over to attack him, he uses the mandibles as blades to attack the bugs. He slashes and punctures, occasionally stomping on a smaller bug, such as a hunter or a scavenger. He keeps up the assault, putting a considerable dent in enemy ranks until one mandible breaks and then the other. He takes this as his cue to keep running and finally reaches his bolter. He sprays the bugs like his gun is the greatest repellent in existence for only a couple of seconds before he reloads. Oxus begins skirting around the hordes across the battlefield until he finds a proper angle for one of the holes. 3 well-placed shots, and the tunnel was closed. He turned to seek out the next hole, but noticed that the Titan had finally loosened up the chainsword in its face. Smacking its head against the outer edge of the nest, it finally knocked it loose, the chainsword tumbling to the ground. The Titan screamed out in what Oxus could deduce was a mix of pain, fiery rage, and pure, unadulterated, vengeful hatred. Oxus ran around, looking for the next tunnel to destroy. Just as he found it, 2 hive guards squeezed their way out of the tunnel. He blasted one's armored head a few times in, proceeding to tear its whole head off, and beat the other hive guard to death with it. After his kill, he looked over, noticing scavengers drawing close. He quickly threw the hive guard's head at them, crushing a few before quickly collapsing the tunnel close to him. The Bile Titan loomed over him, spraying him with more bile. Finally, it had caught him, the force knocking him off his feet as the dreaded bile boiled into the gaps of his armor. But that was it. One small burst of bile instead of the grand waterfall it made before. Oxus looked up, noticing the Bile Titan was in pain, choking on something unknown and occasionally coughing up flecks of bile. His chainsword attack must have been the cause. Oxus took this chance to stand up and run through the Titan's legs. He ran to the last tunnel, but not before swinging by to pick up his chainsword. All the while, he gunned down more bugs. How many could there possibly be, he wondered. The last tunnel was no issue. He closed it like the others. He destroyed every last bug with his bolter, using his chainsword to cut apart any that drew close. It was all well and good until Oxus was crushed from behind by what felt like the weight of 10 moons concentrated on a 4-inch point. It was a miracle his power pack was made to take hits as well as he was. The force lifted itself off of him long enough that he could look back at the Bile Titan. This was also enough time for him to roll out of the way. The Titan pierced the ground right where he was a moment ago before screeching at him. Oxus unloaded the last of his rounds into the Bile Titan's underbelly before it turned, attempting to strike him again with its front legs. He ran far out of its reach, sticking to the edge outside of the nest, reloaded, and began shooting again. This time, he aimed for its back, where he had blown off its armor with the cracker grenade. Eventually, his efforts were enough to weaken it to where it lowered its body closer to the ground. Oxus then had an idea. He armed himself with his chainsword, charged close, and leaped into the Titan's exposed back. It took him hardly more than a second to rip a hole through the Bile Titan, forcing it to collapse as Oxus landed on the ground. He stood and looked around, covered in blood and bile. The nest had gone quiet. The tunnels were closed and no bugs were left to fight him. Oxus breathed heavily. His exhaustion was beginning to catch up to him. His muscles were sore from the strenuous activity and the immense damage he had sustained. He falls to his knees, then his side, and rolls onto his back. He couldn't even be bothered to find a better place, to pass out as his consciousness left him.